Hey class, I'm Miss Crystal, your lecturer today. In section 2021, we'll be talking about the impacts of economic policies on the AD-AS curve, or the economy and the multiplier effects. First off, Module 20, Macroeconomic Policy and Fiscal Policy. So in previous chapters, we mentioned that the economy is self-correcting on the long run. That sounds perfect for eliminating recessionary and inflationary gaps, right? Well, yes and no. Yes, because it does kind of eliminate the gaps on the long run, but no, because it takes a long time and even decades maybe. In fact, that's probably why John Maynard Keynes mentioned that in the long run we are all dead. To say that if you want your economy back to long run equilibrium, the economy better do something to actively pursue the goal, and that is the rationale for the stabilization policy.
Miss Crystal, what is the stabilization policy?
Okay, my only student, Bob. I'll give you a brief explanation. So basically, the stabilization policy shifts the aggregate demand either to the right or to the left, depending on whether there's an inflationary or recessionary gap. It is often used by the government to reduce the recession severity and to shorten the time needed to bring the economy to its potential output. Because as stated before, it takes a long time to wait for the economy to self-correct. Yet, the effects of the stabilization policy depends on the types of shocks on the economy.
Wait, I don't get it. What do you mean shocks?
Chill, young one. Were you listening to Jocelyn's explanation just now?
Yeah, but I still don't get it.
Oh well, I'll give you a more detailed version right now. There are two types of shocks, the demand and supply shock. Shocking, right? Ha ha ha! Okay, anyway, so the demand shock, true to its name, is a sudden shift in the AD curve temporarily, or in the short run, possibly due to tax rates, government spending, or in the money supply. So how do you move the AD curve back to the desired level? Well, by utilizing the monetary and fiscal policy. In fact, the best case is when the policy short-circuits the economic shifts or anticipates and counteracts AD shifts because it will result in price stability, which of course all economists want. Moreover, without policy intervention, the RGDP may fall, and that will result in higher unemployment, which of course economists don't want. Well, graphically, here's what it looks like. A positive demand shock shifts the SRAD curve right, while a negative one shifts it left. This is how I remember it. I know it's slightly weird, but it works. The positive people are always right, and the negative people left. As in, they left the party or something. Well, they left. So,
why don't we use these policies to eliminate our GDP gaps all the time? These policies sound perfect.
Well, actually, here are the trade-offs of the government interventions. When the government uses policies to increase the aggregate demand, it may result in higher budget deficits. Why? Well, take for example, the economy has a recessionary gap. In order to stimulate the economy, the government may cut taxes, increase transfers, or increase government spending. Well, the equation for budget balance is tax revenues minus the government spending. So when the government uses an expansionary policy, the incoming funds will be less than the funds that go out. So it will result in budget deficits. Moreover, policymakers aren't fully informed because nobody can predict exactly what the economy will be like in the future. The only pieces of information available are those from the past or present. Finally, the effects of the policies vary with the situation in the economy, so the results don't always align with what was predicted. It is also commonly believed that gaining today is pretty much borrowing from tomorrow. Sooner or later, they will need to be paid back. So if this nation pumps all of the oil they have, which probably would not happen today, then the next year, there and after, they'll have to cope with no oil. So this is what they believe in. Gains today will be paid back tomorrow.
So is the government intervention good or bad?
Well, that, my dear, is for you to think about. Well, let's look at supply shocks now. True to its name again, it is a sudden shift of the AS curve often caused by changes in the input prices or natural disasters. For example, if Bob needs to use one banana to make each cup of fruit juice that he's selling and the price of banana goes up, then Bob wouldn't want to sell as many cups of fruit juice because the cost will be higher and the profits lower.
So policies could come to the rescue again, right?
Well, actually, no. Government policies cannot easily counteract supply shocks. In fact, it may actually be detrimental to the economy if the supply curve shifts. So when it shifts left, our GDP decreases, unemployment increases, and the price level increases as well. So basically, it's a Pandora's box of undesired economic traits. Here's how it looks like graphically. Positive right and negative left. Fiscal policy. This image shows the percent of government expenditure as a percentage of GDP. The government basically collects a lot of taxes and spends a lot of them. Although comparatively, the US doesn't spend as much in proportion as nations in Europe, but the impacts are still significant. Can anyone in the class explain the government inflow and outflow of funds in this circular flow diagram? We learned this in the previous sections already.
Me. So funds go into the government in the form of taxes and government borrowing. Basically, if the government was a person, it would be his or her income and loans. Funds go out of the government in the form of transfer payments and purchases of goods and services. So it's like a person donates to charity, and has consumer spending.
Yes, that's a wonderful analogy. So where does the money from the taxes go to? Well, most of the government fund outflows take the form of transfer payments. This curious graph is from the 2014 U.S. Office of Management and Budget. Here's another graph with a similar indication of the large amount of transfer payments, even though the percentages vary slightly. Before I move on, just in case you don't know what transfer payments are, they're incomes received from the government in which no goods and services are offered in return. So in the analogy my fellow student, my only student, used, it would kind of be like the donation of the government to the people. And the social insurance, according to the dictionary, is a system of compulsory contribution to enable the provision of state assistance in unemployment. Or, in my own words, the government spending used to protect families from economic hardship. These may include Social Security, which provides income to the old, disabled, and those whose lives are dependent on the deceased beneficiaries. Medicare, which covers the cost of health care of Americans over 65, and Medicaid, which does the same thing as Medicare but are for those with lower incomes, and unemployment insurance and food stamps. So since these government spendings are funded by taxes, what types of taxes are there? Well, let's take a look at this pie chart. You can examine it for a while. It shows the proportion of various types of taxes. As you can see, the individual income taxes make up the largest sector of the graph. Okay, now we shall move to government budget and total spending. As you know, GDP equals to CGIX minus IM. So today we'll mainly be discussing how changes in government spending, or G, are used to shape the policies and bring the economy back to long-run equilibrium. So here I've labeled each of the factors in the GDP. So government spending directly impacts the GDP through the variable G, but the cycle doesn't stop there. Consumer and investment spending are indirectly impacted too, because disposable income, or the total income households have to consume, is the total income received from wages, dividends, interest, and rent, minus taxes plus government transfers, as shown in the equation below. Thus, if we look at the equation, an increase in taxes or a decrease in government transfers decreases the amount of disposable income. And when the DI falls, DI as in disposable income, ceteris paribus, consumer spending falls. Income to one is spending for another. Oppositely, a decrease in taxes or an increase in government transfer increases disposable income. And when DI increases, consumer spending increases too. The government spending will also affect investment spending, but it will be detailed in another module. Basically, all these factors allow the DI to shift.
Miss, in what way does AD shift?
First, if there's a recessionary gap where the equilibrium point is below or to the left of the potential output or the value at the vertical line, then the government will engage in an expansionary policy by increasing government spending or transfer payments, or decreasing taxes. This will allow the AD curve to shift to the right. Keep in mind, these policies directly affect the AD curve, so don't mess up on the AP exam and shift the AS curve. Now, when has this happened before? Let's look at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It was President Obama's first economic stimulus package. $787 billion was granted for this plan in February 2009, through spurring consumer spending, saving between 900,000 to 2.3 million jobs, restoring the trust in the finance industry by limiting bonuses for senior executives in companies. It aimed to end the 2008 recession. Most importantly, it instilled the consumer confidence needed to boost economic growth. Basically, the ARRA was divided into three spending categories. It cut taxes by $288 billion, spent $224 billion in extended unemployment benefits, education, and healthcare, and created jobs by allocating $275 billion in federal contracts, grants, and loans.
What if the economy has an inflationary gap?
Well, in that case, the government will use a contractionary policy to close the inflationary gap. They can do so by reducing government spending, increasing taxes, or reducing transfer payments. The AD can then shift to the left. Case study time! So President Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors recommended in the beginning that there should be a contractionary policy. However, during then, the macroeconomic policy remained largely expansionary. So wage increase shifted the SRAS curve left, but AD kept shifting right, keeping the economy in an inflationary gap. In 1967, President Johnson proposed a temporary 10% increase in personal income tax. However, the Fed, afraid that it's too contractionary, countered this policy with vigorous money growth. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates by 3.99% to counter a 1959 growth of 7.25%, a recession resulted. In 1960, the economy was shrinking 4.2%. Unemployment increased by 6.6%. This also shows the trade-offs, especially for contractionary policy.
Ma'am, so here's a summary of the impacts of the fiscal policy. Basically, when the government spending is more than taxes, it will result in a budget deficit as shown through the budget balance formula. However, in this case, it will be an expansionary policy and will stimulate economic growth. The opposite holds true for the case when spending is less than tax revenues. In fact, US is currently operating on a budget deficit. So, Miss, are fiscal policies stabilizing?
Well, most of the time they attempt to do so, but sometimes they may be countereffective.
Why though?
Because of the time lags. If we look at this graph on this page, the policies only react slightly after it is implemented, so it does not perfectly correspond to the business cycles. In fact, the policy may bring the economy, in this graph, to E prime F prime instead of E and F in this case.
Yay! We are officially done with Module 20!
Yay! Fiscal policy and the multiplier. In this module, we'll learn to estimate the influence of multiplier on the economy and to evaluate the government policies according to that. So the variable G in the GDP equation is directly impacted by the government spending. If the government spends $100 billion building a new highway, then the GDP will directly increase by $100 billion. I mean, if the government doesn't borrow from the loan funds market and cost crowding out. So indirectly, however, there's a multiplier effect. So how does this work? We need to look at the circular flow diagram again. The main factors we'll be discussing in this module are the ones circled, or the inflows and the outflows of the government funds.